Welcome to our first lesson in your AI journey. We're going to kick things off on a clement note by looking at neuroscience and how its principles are applied to artificial intelligence, while considering some basic principles of neural network, what many may consider to be the backbone of artificial intelligence. We think it's a good idea to start each lesson with a roadmap of what we will cover in the session. We do this because it helps set expectations and guides the flow of the learning process. You will notice that there is a timestamp alongside each topic. That's for you to easily navigate to the specific section of the lesson. In this lesson, we will be covering some key concepts of neuroscience and touch on neural networks. We will help you to explore the basic components of the human brain, dissecting the functionalities of the neuron, and then the artificial neuron. For those that don't know, a neuron is a fundamental unit of the brain and nervous system. We will also look into delving into the learning methods associated to artificial intelligence. Let's delve into neuroscience, especially as it's applied to the human brain. Mimicking nature has long been a source of inspiration for humans that assisted many of the innovations of humankind. Take, for instance, the echolocation, or clicking, used by dolphins to orientate themselves and detect prey, or radar used by bats to navigate their world. Way back in 1848, John Stringfellow invented the first unmanned glider, inspired from the flight of the albatross. These are all examples of applications that we humans use to improve our daily lives. Neuroscience is basically the study of the anatomical structure that forms the nervous system. Therefore, it relies on knowledge from various fields, including anatomy, the branch concerned with bodily structure, physiology, the branch that aims to understand the function and mechanisms of living things. Cytology, that's the study of the structure and function of the cell. Remember, the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. And chemistry, especially biochemistry. So, if neuroscience is largely about trying to understand how the human brain works, perhaps we need to start there. Roughly weighing between 1.2 and 1.4 kilograms. It comprises of three compartments: the cerebrum, which is responsible for higher order cognitive functions; the cerebellum, which sits underneath the cerebrum and controls motor functions; and the brainstem, which acts as a relay station between the brain and the spinal cord. For now, we will have a closer look at the cerebrum. The cerebrum primarily contains four lobes: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. These lobes are specialized to perform certain tasks that we will now look at. We need to mention here, before we delve into their different functions, that these lobes are not restricted to the pre-assigned roles pertaining to them within this lesson. Instead, it provides a framework. The frontal lobe is, as the name suggests, the front part of the brain. This is where the cortex is situated. The frontal lobe also contains most of the neurotransmitters, dopamine, the chemical that gives you that rewarding feeling when you complete a task, like saving Princess Peach from the terrible Bowser. The frontal lobes are responsible for facilitating higher order mental functions, such as judgment and planning. Take, for instance, learning to drive. In the beginning, it is a very tough task, needing a lot of thought and precision. This is where the prefrontal lobes come into play, until it becomes a more automated or habitual action, for solving complex daily problems, from working out where the in-laws will be seated at a wedding, to the splitting of the atom. The frontal lobe is considered to be where our intelligence comes from, but this is not entirely true. In my opinion, intelligence acts as a whole. In other words, I believe that all components of the brain work together to form intelligence, and the prefrontal cortex is how our intelligence is communicated. Finally, the frontal lobes are also responsible for self-awareness, asking questions like what my place in this world might be. Unfortunately, this is also where many problems, such as anxiety that comes from the amygdala, are elevated. The temporal lobe sits underneath the frontal lobes, with its left and right hemisphere sort of in line with the ears. The temporal lobe is the lower lobe of the cortex. This region of the brain is responsible for understanding language. When you have an auditory experience, your brain is essentially interpreting signals from the pinna. The pinna captures sound waves and relays it to the ear canal. The signals are then interpreted and the meaning is added simultaneously. The temporal lobe is also responsible for the formation of memories. Take for instance the hippocampus. The hippocampus forms part of the temporal lobe and has been shown to be responsible for the conversion of memories from short to long term. For memories to be formed, they need to be linked to an experience, like burning your hand on a stove. Therefore, the temporal lobe also serves as the region where memories are organized and sequenced together. The temporal lobe is also responsible for the processing of complex visual tasks. The parietal lobe sits at the top of the head and is primarily focused on the interpretation of sensory input. It interprets auditory and touch signals. Because the parietal lobe processes sensory input, it also constructs our spatial visual perception, allowing us to be aware of our surroundings and allowing for better motor control. Take for instance, when you reach out to grab a glass of water, the fact that you can, in one fluid motion, perceive how far the glass is, reach out and grab it without knocking anything in the vicinity over, and bring it precisely to your mouth is actually a series of very complex steps. If you think about doing this task with a robotic hand and a remote control, you would probably be as clumsy as a newborn baby. This is one of the primary functions of the parietal lobe, along with interpreting visual signals. And lastly, the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe sits at the very back of the head and is responsible for the interpretation of early visual signals. Lateralization is one of the misconceptions that has come to light as the field of neuroscience has evolved. Lateralization, in short, assumes that each compartment of the brain has a predefined role. Pioneering work by Bachwarita, Merzenich, and Edward Taub has challenged this idea, instead arguing that the brain is plastic and adaptive. The brain adapts, never really stopping to learn, if only we would encourage it, by always staying curious. Let's now look at the communication machines of our brain, neurons, and cognitive sciences that has been instrumental in understanding how we make decisions. The human brain has several nerve cells. In fact, we have roughly 86 billion connected nerve cells that together form neurons. Neurons are responsible for the processing of information. This information can come in various forms, such as processing of an external stimulus like touch or sound, or the facilitation of crucial neurotransmitters that enable learning and the formation of new memories. At the head of the neuron is the soma. The soma is responsible for the processing of an incoming signal and the corresponding output. The nucleus defines the location of the soma and is responsible for intracellular communication. This is where the synthesis of neural proteins occur. The neuron has branch-like structures with tentacles or dendrites that are like communication branches. The dendrites are responsible for carrying the signal from the neurons for processing. When we refer to the gray matter of the brain, we are essentially referring to the cell bodies of the neurons. White matter is the axons. In the middle of the neuron is what I just mentioned, the axon. The axon is responsible for the propagation of the output produced by the soma to the axon terminals of the neuron. The axon terminals in turn connect to the dendrites of the neurons to further propagate the signal. Structures like the glial cells and myelin sheath, indicated in the light blue segments around the neuron, provide protection, nourishment, and structural support to the neuron. Neurons such as acetylcholine facilitates the protection of the cell, making it clear that the protection of the neuron is as important as the cell itself. Diet and exercise are also important actions for the healthy production of neurotransmitters. Just a fun fact for you, nootropics are largely experimental drugs taken for cognitive enhancement, such as increased attention and motivation, along with neuroprotective properties. Now for the field of cognitive sciences. Cognitive sciences is concerned with all subdomains that involve human cognition. The human mind and how it interfaces with the world has been misplaced due to old and at times outdated theories. Neuroscience and cognitive sciences have allowed for a clearer image to be created of the relational process of the mind. Cognitive sciences considers fundamental human faculties that regulate our daily emotion. I mean, ancient Mesopotamians even believed that emotions represented different gods. Cognitive sciences looks at how the brain are activated when we experience different emotions. Learning has been key to our survival, allowing for us to identify areas that might be dangerous or bountiful. We also learned how to use tools. We now understand the role sleep plays during the formation of new memories. For example, new memories are consolidated during sleep, and sleep resets our learning capacity each night. And lastly, language. Language is a complex and something that we are frantically trying to unravel to better assist us with language-related tasks. Our brain can almost instantaneously convert symbols into meaning when we read text, or convert what we are trying to communicate into symbols when we write. This is an exceptional, efficiently relational system, and one cognitive sciences aims to understand. These modalities is what cognitive science endeavors to unravel. As with most scientific fields, theoretical claims must be backed by evidence. To build experimental evidence, three methods have primarily been employed in cognitive sciences. The first of these is brain imaging. The second, behavioral experiments. And third, probably my favorite, stimulation via computational modeling. Brain imaging, in the form of fMRI and CT scans, have often been applied in medicine and neuroscience. This field is specifically concerned with the tracing and mapping of neural activity. Edward Taub was a revolutionary when it came to mapping neural activity, although some might deem him a bit controversial. Edward Taub mapped the neural activity in the hands of chimps. He made groundbreaking discoveries in the plasticity hypothesis of the brain and helped hundreds, if not thousands, of stroke patients to remap their neural circuitry, allowing them to regain muscle control and regain even speech abilities. Do you know why we said Edward Taub was controversial? Taub was a behavioral scientist who looked at the neural maps in the arms and hands of chimps and how they changed with time. He specifically looked at the effects of severing the nerves leading from the limbs of the peripheral nervous system to the chimp and how the corresponding change affected its representation when he mapped it again back on their mind. This resulted in him being 17 counts of animal cruelty and 6 for failing to provide adequate veterinary care. He is accredited with the invention of constraint-induced movement therapy for rehabilitation in stroke victims and patients with neurological injuries as well as cerebral palsy. The book, The Brain That Changes Itself, covers this story very accurately. Now for behavioral experiments. Behavioral experiments are among the most powerful methods for bringing about change in cognitive therapy. Behavioral experiments have allowed us to examine how humans respond to stimuli, both on a cultural and neurological level. We can understand how culture is used to shape certain vital mental faculties, as outlined by the book The Changing Brain by Norman Doidge. But we also need to understand how our brains work to understand each other. The Stanford Prison Experiment is such an instance, where the mental conditions of students were observed when they were placed in a simulated prison environment, when one group of students were assigned as guards and the others prisoners. The psychological denotations from this simulation were quite remarkable. Interestingly, this simulation was first considered to be an experiment, but ended up being more of a simulation. Have you ever heard of mirror neurons? A quick story to explain it. A team of researchers was tracing neural activity once again in chimps. They were able to pinpoint a single neuron that was involved in a specific grasping action. When the motion occurred, an amplifier would increase the signal from the specific neuron. So, one day, while the researcher was on a break, one of the doctoral students went into the fridge in the lab to fetch something. The student reached into the fridge and was startled when the same noise echoed as when the monkey neuron was fired. When she looked back at the monkey, it had not moved at all. This led to the discovery of mirror neurons. A mirror neuron is a neuron that fires both when an animal acts and when the animal observes the same action performed by another. Now we can understand a bit better why people would often say, "I feel your pain" expression. Stimulation via computational modeling has been used as an alternative over traditional experiments. Stimulation has resulted in us developing better simulation of the human faculties, leading to a more complex understanding of the entire process. Elon Musk's company, Neuralink, is a perfect illustration of this, where they implanted a brain interface into the mind of a monkey. Using this interface, they taught the monkey to control a game using only its mind. Here you can see a video taken directly from Neuralink, which illustrates how they are training the monkey to move the circle around to the boxes. You can see here, he is controlling the joystick, moving around the circle to the square box, while the pipette in his mouth is simply tracing his neural activity, corresponding his movements to what the map looks like. Now you can see him controlling the entire game. The pipette in his mouth is simply there to read his neural activity as he's playing the game and adjust its according output. This is truly phenomenal, and you can see the fidelity and precision with this monkey's control, which I really think is a phenomenal breakthrough in the field. And by the way, the Neuralink has already been implanted into his mind. If you want to know a bit more about that, you can look at Neuralink's initial release when they implanted the link into the skull of a pig. We have learned so much of the human brain, but along with this, we have also discovered many of our cognitive biases. Cognitive biases are a heavily researched topic due to the fact that it helps to explain how we make decisions so that we can emulate these biases, drawing inspiration from our thinking process. The better understanding of human cognition has led to a huge amount of innovation and understanding. Behavioral economics has been a sector with large investment in recent times. Behavioral economics is concerned with how we respond to risk and how we make decisions in certain situations. This has helped to address problems of the self-driving car. On a potentially darker side, think of advertising today. Applications have become more and more concerned with consuming your time, with behavioral experiments designed to draw in as much of your attention as possible by taking advantage of the knowledge of how your brain works. Understanding cognitive processes and how the mind functions has allowed for better physiological treatments by unearthing how our neurons are wired together. Did you know there are more possible neuron configurations in the mind than there are observable atoms in the universe? Much like the AlphaGo board game, which we will talk about in Lesson 3. Now it's time for neural networks, and we'll start off with the artificial neuron. The artificial neuron works almost analogously with the human neuron. First, we receive an input, represented as our X nodes. There is no limit to the number of input nodes. Then, all the inputs are summated, much like it would have been in the soma of the neuron. An activation function is then applied to the summated inputs. This is like when the neuron propagates the process signal from the soma down the axon of the neuron to the axon terminals. Based on the operations performed by the activation function, an output is produced. This output can, just as with a neuron, be used as further inputs to be manipulated in some other form, or it can produce the final output. Take, for instance, the robotic hand. After a series of interactions, the final output would be the actual movement of the artificial limb. But to get to that conclusion, a series of input-output loops were performed. The artificial neuron is not just an abstract concept as it initially might appear. Like we mentioned with simulation via computational modeling, we can simulate many organic processes. Take, for instance, the activation threshold that is required for the firing of a neuron. By observing the firing of neurons, because we understand it on a numerical level, we can now even create circuits that emulate this process, that only uses a few resistors and an op-amp. Simulation helps us to achieve understanding of a concept on a more fundamental level. The artificial neuron is synonymous with the artificial neural network, and it's useful as a general representation of all neural network operations. Similar as with the artificial neuron, we have our set of inputs. Remember, these inputs can come from an external sensor or as the output from another node or layer. This is usually referred to as our input layer. We then also have our set of outputs, usually referred to as the output layer or output layers. Consider this format as a declarative language. With neural networks, we generally understand what output is required, thus it can be specified first. Between the input and output layer, we have an intermediary process referred to as the hidden or dense layers. The way these layers interact can be changed and altered when writing the program that sets up the schematic. The number of hidden layers can be adjusted to perform different functions. The hidden or dense layers are where the activation function and the summation is executed that we refer to in the artificial neuron. Here, we can also adjust the weight of each node. That is, assigning a value to indicate how important a specific node is. Do not worry about it for now, as we'll have a little bit more of a detailed delve into this later in the course. Then, in the output layers, nodes carry instructions to be propagated, either as raw output or as instructions to initiate another process. Now that we understand some of the basic principles of neural networks, let's sketch our very first neural schematic together. First, we have our input layer. In this input layer, let's create two nodes. In our hidden layer, let's create three fully connected nodes. This means each node in the input layer is connected to every node in the hidden layer. Let us now create a single output node. We are, however, not restricted to a single output node, connected to each node in our hidden layer. There, we have successfully drawn up a one-layer neural network with a single output. Quite cool, hey? The whole process of this course is doing this on a practical level. There are many types of schematics that can be implemented, dependent on the task that needs to be performed. One of the simplest and most frequently used neural network schematics is the feed-forward network. In a feed-forward network, information only flows in a forward direction. In the diagram we are going to look at now, each node does the pre-processing based on the prescribed weight and activation function. Remember, the artificial neuron we spoke about a few slides ago, well, the importance of each node can be adjusted. We refer to this as the weight associated with the node. It is not important for the time being, but we will talk more about this at a later stage. Like before, we construct our hidden layer. Like I mentioned, each node is connected to every other node in the preceding layer. We will talk about concepts such as the perceptron within a later lesson. Each node can have a Taylor transforming function, as we mentioned in the artificial neuron. This serves as our activation function. This means each node can perform different computations based on what is specified. When we receive a signal to our input node, processing of that signal occurs. We can then assign a weight to each node and connect it to its hidden layer. In this feed-forward network, each layer is connected to each node in the layer that precedes it, all moving in a forward direction. We then move from the hidden layer to the output layer in a similar one-to-many fashion. When we move from the input to the hidden layer, the output nodes encodes the response that is then fed into the network. Another network that is often stumbled upon is the recurrent neural network. Now, you might be thinking that this looks exactly like the feed-forward network we just discussed. But with just a click of a button, we have a completely new neural network. A recurrent neural network can remember important aspects of the input it received. Thus, a weight can be compared and adjusted accordingly. Imagine if you're playing a video game like Dark Souls. If you progress along a level and die, you learn from that experience and improve from what just happened. This is what a recurrent neural network does. The alternative would be to disregard what you just previously learned in that playthrough and start again from scratch. A powerful illustration of the power of neural networks is GPT-3, created by Elon Musk's OpenAI company. One of the subdivisions is called DALL-E. DALL-E is a language transformer model. DALL-E generates text description into image representations with very high fidelity. For instance, the image you see above is directly from the GPT-3 website, and the description used to create the images illustrated was simply armchair in the shape of an avocado, and this is what was generated. A truly remarkable progress made by GPT-3. If you're also interested, you can go look at the ADI conversation held by GPT-3 for further astonishing results. Let's have a quick look at some of the applications recurrent neural networks are used for. Recurrent neural networks is a popular network used for time series analysis. Time series analysis can be used, for instance, in predicting weather or warehouse demand. And it's also used in speech and handwriting recognition tasks, where you take a person's style of writing into consideration, which can greatly increase accuracy compared to when a general model is applied. In the last section of this lesson, we are going to elaborate further on two more learning methods called meta and transfer learning. We're also going to quickly look at GAN networks, which has been instrumental in many neural network applications today. Rather than learning a concrete task, like supervised learning, meta-learning focuses on the problem of learning how to learn. In terms of learning how to solve a problem, and something that we should all pay attention to, as outlined by Dr. Barbara Oakley in her course, Learning How to Learn. Focusing on the actual methods of learning helps models to adapt to its environment, depending on how data is fed into the system, or when predictions and requirements change. The system can better adapt to these incoming changes. This could also lead to novel methods in addressing problems that might not have been directly beneficial to the current system, but could also assist another model that is related to another task. Think about when you learn mathematics. Breaking down a problem into sequential steps not only assists you with mastering the subject, but you can also relay those principles of breaking down a task into smaller chunks into your daily life, from doing chores to solving complex problems. Thus, a learned meta skill can assist you in various domains of your life, but it can even help programs to adapt to different games, like applying similar logic rules between dot and boxes and the SOS game. Although they are different, they are related. Transfer learning is something that might sound straightforward, but in practice it's quite difficult to achieve. Transfer learning is the idea of using a pre-existing model designed for a certain task and reappropriating it to another slightly different task. This ties into the idea of model robustness and AI explainability. This adapted model would require minimal retraining of data, which is sometimes the most intensive task in a project. Transfer learning is often used in object detection of images and videos. A GAN network is an extremely interesting concept because it can be used as a type of learning method, but also as a neural network of its own. GANs allow for data augmentation because it simulates data conditions, creating more data instances. In its turn, this means that less data is required when considering the creation of a new model. This also means that models need less turnover time due to the fact that data is synthetically created and creates more data that can be used in further applications. This would be the equivalent of a company printing their own resources, where in our instance the resource is data, and this resource allows us to quickly train models. And it creates more data that can be used along the pipeline in different projects, if it is feasible. So let's look at the properties of the GAN network. In a generative adversarial network, a latent variable is introduced. This latent variable can be a set of mathematical operations that are then performed by computational algorithms. This latent variable acts as a random variable that is tailored to represent the same conditions that are being addressed by that model. The desired variable is fed into a generator. The generator is used to create a simulated data based on the conditions from that latent variable that was introduced. A sample is then taken from the actual data we have, along with a sample from the generated data, and is fed into a discriminator. The discriminator then makes a classification whether the data was correct, true positive, or incorrect, true negative. Based on this classification, a loss is determined. Based on the loss score of this loss function, further steps can be taken to improve the overall model. Because this allows the model to cycle through more true-false scenarios, it learns more accurately and precisely. By the way, GANs were introduced in a paper by Ian Goodfellow, one of the revolutionary researchers within artificial intelligence. Ian Goodfellow wrote the paper on generative adversarial networks while studying at the University of Montreal in 2014. Referring to GANs, Facebook's AI research director Zhen Leshun referred to adversarial networks as the most interesting idea within the last 10 years in machine learning. The process of generative adversarial networks was implemented and proved to be very successful in computer vision tasks. But let's look at this principle and understand what it really entails. For instance, one pixel variation at the edge of an image might alter the entire prediction of that image. We ultimately want our models to be as robust as possible, something that GANs is helping us to achieve by identifying cases where the anomaly might occur. GAN networks help us to identify edge cases where this might occur, preventing any unwelcome surprises further along the road. Although most often used in computer vision and detection tasks, GAN networks have even been adapted to suit some natural language processing tasks, but we will touch on this a bit more later. Congratulations for completing the first lesson in your AI journey. Remember, within Module 1, we will be looking at 10 lessons. From then on out, there will be 8 lessons per module.